This is a story about the moment a question got answered. Not with words, not with arguments, not with statistics pulled from a spreadsheet or debated on a television panel. It was answered in real time, in front of millions of people, on the biggest stage the sport of basketball has ever produced. And the man who answered it did so in a way so complete, so overwhelming, so almost mathematically precise in its devastation, that the question has never seriously been asked again. To understand what happened in June of 1992, you have to understand what was being debated in the months leading up to it. Basketball in that era was defined by a single dominant figure. Michael Jordan of the Chicago Bulls had won 2 consecutive NBA championships, 2 Finals MVP awards, 6 scoring titles, and had built a reputation so large it had begun to feel less like sports achievement and more like mythology. He was not just the best player in the league. He was, in the minds of most people who followed the game seriously, the best player who had ever played the game. Full stop. No asterisk, no qualifier, no rival clause. But in the spring of 1992, something unusual started happening. A legitimate counter-argument began forming, not from the media, who were collectively and almost unanimously in the Jordan camp, not from coaches or executives around the league who spoke about Jordan the way geologists speak about a natural force. The counter-argument came from Portland, from Oregon, from the Portland Trail Blazers and their transcendent guard, Clyde Drexler. Clyde Drexler was, by any reasonable measure, one of the 5 best basketball players on the planet in 1992. He was 6 feet 7 inches of athleticism, basketball intelligence, and competitive fire. He could score from anywhere on the floor, could create his own shot off the dribble, could defend multiple positions, could distribute the ball with precision, and could carry a team on his back through an entire playoff series when he needed to. His nickname was Clyde the Glide, which told you everything you needed to know about how he moved. Smooth, effortless, inevitable. He made the game look like it required no effort at all, which is the mark of someone who has spent so many thousands of hours drilling the fundamentals that the fundamentals have dissolved into pure instinct. The Trailblazers of 1992 were not a one-man team. They had Terry Porter running the point, they had Kevin Duckworth in the middle, they had Jerome Kersey bringing energy and defense, they had Cliff Robinson coming off the bench with scoring that nobody could consistently contain. But Drexler was the center of gravity. He was the reason Portland had the second-best record in the West, the reason they had gotten through what was considered a brutally difficult Western Conference gauntlet, and the reason they were standing across from the Chicago Bulls in the NBA Finals, looking like a team that genuinely believed it could win 4 games. The comparison between Drexler and Jordan had been building for weeks. Sports journalists who needed compelling angles for finals coverage found the best one available and pushed it hard. Both players were athletic shooting guards who could score in volume, defend at a high level, and take over games in critical moments. They had both been drafted in 1984. They were contemporaries, mirrors of each other in certain ways, playing the same position, producing at the same elite level. The narrative wrote itself almost too easily. What if the best player in the game was not Jordan at all? What if Drexler, who had flown slightly more under the radar because his team played on the West Coast and his personality was less magnetic than Jordan's theatrical intensity, was actually the equal or superior of the man everyone crowned champion? Drexler himself did not shy away from the comparison. In interviews during the finals build-up, he spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had watched himself play at the highest level for years and reached his own conclusions. He did not trash Jordan. He did not manufacture a feud or produce inflammatory statements designed to fill newspaper column inches. But he also did not deflect or minimize the question the way some players would have. He was, he said, in so many words across multiple conversations, a player of comparable quality. He had comparable skills, comparable achievements, comparable impact on his franchise. He was not inferior. He believed that. He meant it. And that belief, sincere and measured as it was the spark that lit the fire. Michael Jordan heard everything. Jordan always heard everything. One of the defining characteristics of his competitive psychology was a near supernatural ability to locate slights, real or perceived, and convert them into fuel. He had done it his entire career, with coaches who doubted him, with teammates who questioned his methods, with executives who passed on him in the draft, with opponents who claimed they could stop him. Every doubt, every challenge, every whispered suggestion that someone somewhere might be at his level became material, became motivation, became something he added to the internal furnace that had been burning since he was a teenager and that, in the summer of 1992, had reached temperatures that the Portland Trail Blazers were completely unprepared to withstand. Game 1 of the 1992 NBA Finals was played at the Chicago Stadium on the 4th of June. The building was an institution, an old arena that held noise the way a cupped hand holds water, and on that night it was so loud from the opening tip that conversations in the lower bowl were conducted through lip reading and hand signals. The Bulls were defending champions. Their crowd understood what that meant. They had watched this team win it before. They expected to see it again. What they did not expect was what Michael Jordan proceeded to do in the first half of that game. The opening minutes were competitive. Portland came out focused and organized, running their offense efficiently, mixing up their defensive coverage to keep Chicago unsettled. Drexler was engaged and active, scoring early, distributing crisply, looking like exactly the player the comparison had described. For the first few possessions, the argument felt reasonable. The two teams matched each other possession for possession. The crowd's confidence had the particular quality of something that has not yet been fully earned. Then Michael Jordan started making threes. This requires context, because it was not what Jordan was known for. His game in 1992 was built on mid-range brilliance, on attacking the basket with an explosiveness that no off-guard of his era could match, on the pull-up jumper off the dribble that defenders knew was coming and still could not stop. The three-point shot existed in his arsenal, but it was not a primary weapon. It was not what you feared first when you were drawing up a defensive scheme against Chicago. But on that night, in that first half, in front of that crowd with Drexler on the other side of the court, and millions of people watching on television, and the question of who was actually the best player in the world still technically open for debate, Jordan started pulling up from beyond the arc and putting the ball through the basket with a frequency that began to feel less like basketball and more like something was being demonstrated. Something was being proven. Not for the team's sake, not for the championship, but for the record, for history. For anyone who had looked at Clyde Drexler and thought, even briefly, that the conversation was genuinely open. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 three-point shots in the first half of Game 1 of the NBA Finals. A man who was not primarily a three-point shooter against a defense that was specifically prepared to stop him in the most important game context his sport could produce, making 6 consecutive long-range shots with the casual rhythm of someone shooting around in practice before the gym fills up. After the 6th, Jordan turned toward the scorer's table. He turned toward the sideline where the television cameras were stationed and where millions of people watching at home were already trying to process what they had just seen. And he shrugged. Not a dramatic shrug. Not a shrug designed for highlight reels or commercial campaigns or motivational posters. Just a small, honest, slightly helpless shrug. The shrug of a man who was himself a little surprised, who had gotten hot in a way that even he could not fully explain, who was communicating in the most human way possible that something was happening here that was beyond planning or intention. But also, underneath the surprise, was something else. The shrug was also an answer. It was the most efficient answer possible to the question that had been asked for weeks. It was Jordan standing at the intersection of the argument and reality, and letting the scoreboard provide the rebuttal. He finished the first half with 35 points. 35 points in 24 minutes of basketball. The Portland Trail Blazers came to the locker room at halftime, having played organized, disciplined, competitive basketball, and were down by enough points that the word comeback was already entering the commentary in a way that acknowledged just how unlikely one would be. The second half was not the explosion the first half was. Jordan did not need it to be. The work was done. The statement had been made. He finished the game with 39 points, and the Bulls won by a score that made the question of comparative greatness feel not just answered but permanently filed. The Drexler-Jordan debate, which had been the dominant framework through which the entire finals was being viewed, had been submitted to the ultimate available test, and had returned a verdict so unambiguous that it was difficult to know what to do with the counter-argument. It was not that Drexler was exposed as lesser than his reputation. That would be the wrong way to read what happened. Clyde Drexler was an exceptional basketball player. He proved that in 1992, and for years afterward. He would eventually win a championship himself in 1995, with the Houston Rockets alongside Hakeem Olajuwon, proving that his ability to contribute to a winning team at the highest level was real and lasting. He deserved the respectful conversations about his place in the hierarchy of the game. What happened was something different and more specific. What happened was that the space between Drexler and Jordan, which the comparison had tried to shrink to nothing, turned out to be real. It was not a small distinction being made visible. It was the gap between an exceptional player and the singular best player who ever lived, made undeniable in the most direct way the moment could provide. The Bulls won Game 2 as well, and then the series went to Portland, where the Trailblazers stabilized and fought back with the pride and competitive quality that had gotten them to the finals in the first place. They won Games 5 and 6 and forced a seventh game, which the Bulls ultimately won to claim the championship. The series was not the blowout that Game 1 might have suggested it would be. Portland was good, Drexler was good, the competition was real. But the question of who was better was not revisited. Game 1's first half had performed a kind of closure on that particular debate that no subsequent individual game could reopen. The 6 threes and the shrug had become one of those basketball images that exist permanently in the memory of anyone who saw it, not because it was the most artistically beautiful thing Jordan ever did, but because it was the most precise communication of competitive dominance at the exact moment when someone needed to hear it most clearly. Jordan and Drexler were not enemies. They were colleagues in the small community of people who have ever played basketball at the level they played it. In the years after 1992, they were consistently respectful of each other in public and reportedly friendly in the private corridors of the league that players inhabit separately from media and fans. Drexler understood what Jordan was. Jordan understood what Drexler was. Only the external conversation had confused the two for a moment. What is worth sitting with, decades later, is the mechanism of what happened. Jordan did not call a press conference. He did not write an open letter. He did not orchestrate a campaign to correct the public record. He did nothing that exists outside the game itself. He simply played basketball at a level that made the external conversation unnecessary, that made words feel like a transportation method that the moment had outgrown. This is a pattern that defines him. There are 100 moments across his career where the response to doubt or challenge was not speech but performance. The flu game against Utah, when he was visibly ill and barely functional, and still dragged his team to a victory that no other player would have attempted. The 15 consecutive points against the Knicks in a playoff game in 1993 that his own coach had not drawn up, and that simply emerged from somewhere inside his competitive system when the moment required it. The shots in the final seconds of games that he made not once or twice but repeatedly, almost reliably, until it stopped being considered remarkable and started being considered simply what Jordan does when the game matters. The 1992 Finals first half sits among those moments, but it has a unique quality the others do not. It was the most direct answer to the most specific question. It was not just Jordan being dominant. It was Jordan being dominant in response to someone suggesting that dominance was shared or disputed. The competitive architecture of the moment shaped the response in a way that made it feel personal, almost conversational, as if the 6 three-pointers were sentences in an argument that only needed to be made once. Clyde Drexler, when asked about that night in interviews conducted years afterward, spoke about it with the honesty of someone who has processed a difficult experience long enough to see it clearly. He acknowledged the performance. He acknowledged Jordan's superiority without diminishment of his own career or his own legitimate place in the history of the game. There was a dignity in the way he discussed it. The dignity of someone who went up against the best version of the greatest player and was honest enough to call it that. There are arguments in sport that statistics can settle. There are arguments that career arc can settle, that championship counts can settle, that Hall of Fame selections and all-star appearances and retired jersey numbers hanging from arena rafters can settle. These are all legitimate forms of evidence. But there is a category of argument that only the game itself can settle, where the question is not what a player has done across a career, but what he will do right now, tonight, in this building, against this opponent, when the size of the moment is at its absolute largest, and the man on the other side of the comparison has been sent to the arena to make the case for a different answer. Those arguments require performance. They require the actual competition to speak. On June 4, 1992, in the first half of Game 1 of the NBA Finals, Michael Jordan made 6 three-point shots in 24 minutes at the Chicago Stadium, with 40,000 eyes in the building and millions more watching through television screens around the world, then turned to the cameras with a small, honest, slightly surprised shrug, and settled the argument the only way anyone has ever ultimately settled anything that matters in sport. He played. He answered. He moved on. The championship trophy came at the end of it, as it had come the year before and as it would come again in the years that followed. But the trophy, for all its weight and permanence, was not the answer to the question that had been asked in those spring weeks of 1992. The answer to that question was the shrug. The answer was those first 24 minutes. The answer was the quiet, final, completely undeniable language of someone who has been asked who he is and has decided to show you rather than tell you, because he has always understood that showing is the only statement the game requires.